The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Today on Science for the People, we've got a panel of avid science readers ready to discuss the best science books of 2014, just in time for your last-minute Christmas shopping. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell. In case you haven't noticed, we are big fans of science books on this show. And with Christmas coming, we thought you might like a little help with your shopping, especially for all these science-savvy readers on your list. With me is Brian Clegg, author of many popular science and math books, including most recently Final Frontier, the pioneering science and technology of exploring the universe, and Extrasensory, the science and pseudoscience of telepathy and other powers of the mind, among many others. He's also an avid reader of science books and regularly writes reviews for the online blog Popular Science. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Hi there.
Also with me is John Dupuis, a science and engineering librarian at the Stacey Science and Engineering Library at York University in Toronto. John has a Master's of Library and Information Studies degree and blogs at Confessions of a Science Librarian. His research and professional interests include science books, the future of academic libraries, open access advocacy, scholarly communications and computer science, and the ever-depressing Canadian science policy topics. Sorry, John. I keep calling you for those.
It's okay.
He can be found online at his blog, Confessions of a Science Librarian, and his Tumblr, where he keeps track of issues in Canadian science policy. Welcome back, John.
Glad to be here.
And interestingly, stepping to the other side of the microphone, is our very own Rochelle Saunders. You have heard Rochelle on the show many times talking as one of our hosts. And, of course, behind the scenes, she stays busy keeping my schedule and everybody else's schedules in order as our wonderful producer. So, Rochelle, I have to say, does this feel weird?
It does feel a little bit weird. Back to, actually to the very first time I was on the show.
Okay, well, we are very happy to have you there anywhere, really. So before we start talking about specific books, I want to talk a bit about genres of science books, because everyone has a favorite. So what are yours? Brian, let's start with you.
Well, my background is physics and computing, so those tend to be the topics that really make my eyes light up. I have to confess, biology is probably my least interest, and I run a mile from medical topics because I'm basically squeamish.
Okay, and how about Rochelle?
I have a tendency also to go for physics books. Those were the first ones I fell in love with, so they're the ones I constantly return to. And in the last couple of years, I've really latched onto pop math books. I've discovered math is an interesting thing, so I really can't stay away. I'm also an absolute sucker for anything science history. Any figure, any science time, I'll read all of them. I tend to stay away from books about animals. I don't really know why. They just don't pull me in.
And John, what about you?
Well, I think for me it's not so much a genre, but I think I look for stuff in a particular format. I tend to look for a lot of science-themed graphic novels, and that's really what the kinds of things that I've been looking out for the last couple of years, which is kind of nice because it gives me kind of a variety of topics within that genre, within that format. So that's been kind of what I've been seeking out the last few years. In terms of kind of topic areas, the last couple of years I've been reading maybe a little bit more about science and society or climate change or that sort of thing. So that might be the kinds of topic area that's been interesting me the last couple of years.
And how many science books would you say you folks read in 2014, approximately? Rochelle?
I actually counted, and it's been 26 since the end of November last year.
Oh, we have issues. Okay. John?
I'm up around that same area, 23, 25, something like that.
Brian?
And I counted as well, and scarily it was 53.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so we have a lot to choose from. So actually, would you say that 2014 was a good year in terms of science books?
Well, I think actually it was, I think an average year. There was a lot of really good books, but one of the things that often, like the way I kind of track the lists of the books that come out, some years you notice a really big book, the book that everybody is reading. And there didn't seem to be quite that book this year. Interestingly, I think the closest to that book, the one that everyone read, might have been The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, which is actually one of the ones I didn't read. It seemed like a pretty good year, but without that kind of big book that everyone read. A good example of that big book from the last couple of years might have been the Steve Jobs book from a couple of years ago, or the Henrietta Lacks book from a couple of years before that, right? The book that just everybody read.
Brian, how about you?
Yeah, I'd say pretty much the same. It was a reasonable year, pretty average, and I again really struggled to pick out a really standout book. There were some great books I enjoyed very much, but not one that I would say, this is one of the best of the last 10 years or something like that.
Rochelle?
I found this year was pretty average as well, though I found a little bit that my personal reading choices shifted a little bit. I read a lot more medical books this year than I have ever read before. And in general, I enjoyed myself, which I found a bit surprising.
Well, what do you guys look for in a science book when you're thinking of picking it up?
It's a difficult one because in the end, it's a whole mix of things. I tend to go on things like publishers' catalogs and press releases, although some publishers rather kindly basically just send me everything they produce. And it's a mix. It really is. Sometimes a cover will catch your eye. Sometimes the topic is just one that nobody's ever covered before. It really stands out as something interesting. And to my surprise, occasionally I'll get a book I think, oh, another one like that, put it to one side, won't read it for 6 months, and when I come to it, it's one of the best books I've read in the year. So it's very difficult, to pin it down. It's just a feeling, I guess.
Yeah, other than kind of always grabbing books from favorite authors or authors I'm aware of that I've enjoyed their writing in the past, for me, it's really, I love book blurbs. I could read book blurbs all day. I like movie trailers and book blurbs. So I really am drawn to a well-written book blurb, even though I've been disappointed by some of them in the long run.
For me, like I said, I enjoy, like Brian, I enjoy the randomness of publishers just sending me stuff. That's how I've discovered a bunch of the best books that I've read over the last few years. And like I said, I also look at that format, the science themed graphic novel, and I try and read pretty well all of the ones that come out. And that's also something that, I look at that, I look for that format. I also look, again, I tend to find stuff, history of physics, very interesting, history of math, I like also the history of technology. I tend to my definition of science books also includes technology books. So I also look for books on technology or the history of technology, which I find very interesting.
Do any of you look at reviews?
Sometimes. What I tend to do when I read reviews, or when I actively seek out reviews, is I've heard an inkling of something on Twitter or on Facebook or from one of the science journalists that I follow, and I sort of hear mutterings about a book, either one way or the other, and then I have a tendency to kind of seek out some more reviews and find some more reviews, good or bad, sort of, should I read this book or shouldn't I read this book?
I find reviews a good way of introducing randomness, and so I'll watch the New York Times or the Globe and Mail to see what they're reviewing. And it's a good way. It's a good way to introduce a little kind of randomness or serendipity.
I tend to avoid other people's reviews just because I review pretty well every book I read, and I guess I don't really want to sort of taint my review with other people's, so no, I tend to avoid them. Interestingly,
quite often after I've read a book, especially if I've read a book for the show, I do have a tendency to seek out reviews if I can find them, because I'm interested in other people's analysis of the book or thoughts on the book, any major controversies that have arisen, and also, to some extent, I know that some of the reviewers may have a background in maybe some of the science that they're talking about when we're talking about science book reviews. So sometimes that helps me understand where some of the really good parts about the book are, and maybe some of the negative qualities that would have taken me ages to figure out.
You're listening to Science for the People, and I'm Desiree Schell. Today we're talking about science books. Lots of science books. Now, John, you mentioned the New York Times. I want to talk about the New York Times bestseller list, because we hear about bestsellers all the time, and it does impact what books get heard about and what books don't. So, does anybody know how a book makes the bestseller list by any chance?
I think it's, voodoo or magic or something. What they do is, well, yeah, I don't know for sure, but basically they have kind of a set of places they go to get sales figures, and they use those. But I'm not sure. I wouldn't say necessarily that the way they compile lists is completely scientific.
That's what I was assuming.
Or perfectly statistically valid.
Well, I looked at the bestseller list, the science bestseller list specifically for every month in 2014, and there were definitely some up there with some staying power. And since they are so popular, I thought that we should at least mention them and get opinions from you guys. So, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Now, that was 11 months on the bestseller list. Does anyone have any positive or negative thoughts on this one?
I'm going to get a confession in. I've never read it. In fact,
I've also not read it.
Yeah, me neither.
Okay,
I tend to not actually end up reading a lot of the books that are the big sellers, honestly.
Why is that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, occasionally I will, like I said, the Steve Jobs book from a couple of years ago. But I don't actually check them very often. And like I said, I think I tend to be more interested in some of the niche topics. I'm looking at my list here, and maybe the only two that I've read that might have tickled the bestseller lists might have been the Glenn Greenwald book, No Place to Hide. And probably also This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. Those might be the only two books that I read this year that even tickled the bestseller lists.
And are you both in the same boat, Brian and Rochelle?
I've certainly read very few of the books that are on the list, and I'd agree. I do tend to slightly avoid. I mean, I didn't read A Brief History of Time for 20 years. I did eventually read it, but it took me a while to get around to it. But in the end, I think part of the problem is with a list like this is what it's telling you is books that have sold a lot. Now, if you watched, I don't know, TV based on things everybody watches, then you start watching.
Everyone would be watching 2.5 Men.
Exactly. And I think you need more variety. And the other thing I'd say is these lists are also pretty vague in their attribution. So, I wouldn't count the Naomi Klein book myself as a science book.
That's, I think, one of the things for me about the New York Times bestseller science book list. And I think possibly sort of science categories that you would find online, sometimes in general, is a lot of stuff you see on them doesn't really strike me as actually fitting a science theme. I had a look through some of these, the big New York Times bestsellers, and there's several of them on there that I don't know that I would really count as science books. And just from the standpoint of even looking for books to feature on the show, I don't know that they would necessarily fit our theme.
Are you talking about the fact that many of them seem like self-help books as opposed to science books?
There does seem to be a bit of a mixture of self-help sounding books. And again, I haven't read a lot of them because they do strike me a bit as self-helpy, and I'm not really interested in that general topic. But it does also seem that a lot of those are quite popular, or some of the most popular books in the science category. I'm just thinking, every time Malcolm Gladwell writes something, it goes up on the bestseller list. And we haven't really talked that much about Malcolm Gladwell, but he's a notorious cherry picker. And from a science perspective, there's not a lot of really good, well written up science in his books, to be honest. There's a lot of speculation.
I'd agree. I wouldn't really, again, count Malcolm Gladwell particularly as a science writer. But I think what's interesting, this overlap between self-help and science, is that sometimes it's genuine. Sometimes you'll get a book that basically is taking something like the latest scientific evidence on, say, how to improve your brain power, if you like. So looking at what's been done with different drugs or whatever. And I can see that fits very well. But there are other books that, frankly, it is very hard to understand how they got in there.
I often wonder what either bookstores or publishers, how they classify the books. Like, is there a rule or an algorithm that they follow to say this book is a science book and this book isn't? Because sometimes there are really strange things that you find in science categories. I'm just thinking the last time I flipped through the Amazon.com science book category, there was some weird stuff in there that seemed a little bit out of place.
Yeah, sometimes I find that they combine the kind of public health or health books with the science books, and that ends up with a lot of strange combinations.
Also, a lot of diet books.
Yes, exactly. Or diet, or books that seem to be about food science that are somehow also diet books, and vice versa. And sometimes I get the feeling that there's some hidden gems there. There are probably some really good ones. But who wants to read the 43 bad ones to find the 2 good ones, right? So I'll proudly say that I've never read anything by Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, since I was the one who brought up Malcolm Gladwell, I do want to say that Malcolm Gladwell, when I was first starting to get back into reading science books back in my early 20s, I did read a lot of Malcolm Gladwell because he's very readable and the books are interesting. I didn't have the same kind of knowledge I had back then, but I will give him credit for helping pull me back into the genre. So it's one of those things where if they're pulling some people in who then go on to read, better science books, more science books, then I think I can excuse his sometimes lax judgment in how he represents science.
You are so charitable. I'm wondering though, for those of us who are trying to avoid the self-help area, but would like to read more books in the science area, is there any way to tell by a cover or a blurb, or how would you help people distinguish between those so they don't spend their hard-earned money where it should not be?
Well, I would tend to avoid books that seem to promise something, that seem to promise that the world is simpler or more easy to understand than you thought it was. And so that, especially as a librarian, that's the kind of thing that I always tend to watch out for is, again, like I said, this thing, your brain works way better than you think it does. Well, your brain works the way it does. Or, the food system is so evil and it's all their fault that maybe you're not eating as well as you should. So the book I tend to be skeptical of books that seem to promise that the world is simpler than it seems to be.
Or promise an easy answer.
I promise an easy answer, yeah. And I think that very much, books about the environment, books about public health, books about health, if they're promising that the world is simpler than it seems, you should probably be skeptical.
I do read, I actually do sometimes tiptoe into the public health genre for science books. I do so very carefully and very selectively, and I find what helps me pick better books overall is actually looking at the authors and doing a little bit of research into the authors of some of the public health books or food-based books to find out, because you find out really quickly if they have an axe to grind, and if someone has an axe to grind or is a huge advocate of a particular fad diet or a particular trend that's going on right now, I tend to stay away from those because those tend to be more about selling their idea or selling the trend that they're following rather than a comprehensive look at the topic.
And of course, another advantage is if you mostly read physics, there's not a lot of self-help in physics.
It's very true.
But there's a lot of crazy people in physics.
That's true.
So, I have at varying times during my career been the physics librarian at York University. Not so much anymore, but certainly 10 or 15 years ago when I was starting my career, people would send me books, print books at the library, just random people in the mail sending me a book at the library. Please add this to your physics collection. Well, within 5 minutes of examining the book, it was really obvious that here was a person that was going with the idea that, Einstein was wrong, or quantum physics is wrong. It's really secret, the ether or whatever. So yes, I had spent a good chunk of my early career going through a fair number of these random books that were just sent to me out of the blue, that were just written by people that didn't have much of a grasp on science. Interestingly enough, they were often engineers writing about physics, so that might be a clue as well.
We still get those emails, sir.
I'd say there are a couple of
sure
things.
You do.
I'd say there are a couple of things to watch out for, which is basically self-published physics books you have to be really wary about. And also, if it's anybody saying Einstein is wrong, quantum theory is wrong, whatever, then take it with a pinch of salt. At least check who the author is. If it's a physics professor at a major university, then it's going to be interesting. But as you say, if it's somebody who is designed, a new wheel to go on a couch, then it probably isn't.
On the topic of physics books, actually, I find one of the more difficult problems to solve when picking a physics book for me is finding one that's written at the appropriate level. So because I've read a lot of physics books and a lot of the kind of intro to or entry level ones, I'm looking for something that's a little bit more advanced, but not so advanced that I get completely lost. And sometimes that's really hard to determine before you kind of get into the book.
This is Science for the People, and I'm Desiree Schell. Today I'm joined by a panel of science readers to talk about the last year's haul of great science books. Now, before we get into the books that we loved, because I want to talk about that, I have to ask you, because I am the curious sort, and I don't want to end this panel on a negative, what was the worst book that you read this year?
Yeah, I think we're all a little hesitant to dip our toe into this one. Oh, I'm not sure. I won't say the worst book, but there was a couple on the side of books that were written for kids or young people that I found a bit disappointing. In particular, there's this one, Really Big Numbers by Richard Evan Schwartz, which is published through, I think, the American Mathematical Association. And it looks like it's trying to explain big numbers, to young people. And the way it's set up and illustrated and formatted, it looks like it's aimed at, 5, 6-year-olds. But once you dig into the book, he very quickly gets into very advanced topics. And to me, I think I was a bit disappointed in that I thought it was going to be really cool, that it was a book that was a book about big numbers that was aimed at young kids. But quickly he got into stuff that maybe 1 in a billion 6-year-old would be able to grasp. And so I found it's not that it was a terrible book. I thought it actually explained its topics really well. But I thought it kind of the way it was, the format didn't match the content, and I found that kind of disappointing.
Brian?
I have to say, as an author, it's really painful sort of singling out a book as bad. But if you forced me, there was a book on Copernicus called Celestial Revolutionary by John Freely. And I was really interested in this because there's not been that much written in detail about Copernicus. Obviously, important figure in the history of science. But it read to me, the thing it really reminded me about is that scene in Alice in Wonderland when everybody's got wet in her pool of tears, and she tries to dry them out by reading some very dry history. Some really, really dull history. And unfortunately, there's a huge amount that's like that. There are paragraph after paragraph of detailed history and it's just all facts. There's no narrative. That's what really lost it for me. So there's good stuff in it, but I don't think it worked as a book.
Yeah, there was a book on Galileo from a year or two ago that had the same problem. It was just it's a book I felt I should have loved, but I could barely struggle my way through reading the actual pages.
This year I read a book called Game Changer, about game theory, by David McAdams. And while I enjoyed the book and I learned a lot from it, I was a little bit disappointed because it really didn't cover the topic as robustly as I wanted it to. It very much drilled down and focused on the prisoner dilemma. It was, example after example after example of prisoner dilemma, which now I understand prisoner's dilemma a lot better, but I don't understand any other areas of game theory at all because they weren't even kind of touched on. So I don't know that it would be the worst book I ever read, but it did disappoint me in that I don't know that it was clear that I was only going to be reading about one topic in quite an interesting area.
I have definitely had experiences where I go into the book thinking it's going to be about one topic, and that is not the topic that it is about at all. The blurb is very misrepresentative. So let's talk about the thing that we all want to talk about, which is the books we loved in 2014. So what's the best book you read this year? John?
So this is a tough one. I'm gonna say one best graphic novel and one best book. So the best graphic novel, the best science-themed graphic novel that I read this year was called Climate Change, A Personal Journey Through the Science by Philippe Squarzoni. It's a book that was translated from the French. And so basically what it is this regular guy, Philippe Squarzoni, who, he's a graphic novel writer. That's his job. And so what he does is he essentially takes climate science and explains the science and its real-world implications and talks about, ways forward, technological solutions, social solutions. And it's a fairly long graphic novel, but he presents the material in an extremely organized and understandable way. I thought it was an absolutely amazing book. It's one of the best science-themed graphic novels that I've ever read, because it's written by a non-scientist, and his idea is to explain the science very, very clearly to a non-science audience. And so I thought it was just really wonderful. The book, which was actually the only novel that's appeared on one of my science lists in the last couple of years. It's this little book that probably no one's ever heard of. It's called Zombies in Calculus by Colin Adams. And so, like I said, it's a novel, and it's set at a university. And the book starts by a bunch of zombie students wandering into a college math class, and they start eating their fellow students. And so this sounds a bit bizarre, but basically what the author does is it's quite a short novel. What he does is he uses calculus to explicate how the zombie apocalypse unfolds. And he gets into a lot of really serious scientific and mathematical detail. So, growth rates, the paths that zombies take when they wander across a field and that sort of thing. So I thought it was a really cool way of explaining both the stuff of calculus and why calculus is important. And to me, it was, like I said, it was one of the best books that I read. It was one of the best it was one of the best books I've read in a long time that explains kind of a serious scientific topic in a way that is really compelling and interesting.
Brian?
I think I'd go for Where Do Camels Belong by Ken Thompson. And the reason it stands out to me is one of those books that for weeks afterwards I kept telling people about it and sort of telling little stories from it, which I think is always a good sign that their book's really got at you. And it's about the way that ecologists consider species that come to a country from others, evil invaders, even when there's no good reason to do so. And one of the things he does is to demonstrate how a lot of invading species actually improve diversity. But the other thing I think is very interesting is he shows how really difficult it is to say what is a native species anyway. So the title, the Where Do Camels Belong? Camels actually originate in the US, and another example would be rabbits, which people in the UK have always thought that the Romans brought here, so they're not native to the UK technically, rabbits. But it turns out actually they were here until the previous ice age, and then they were wiped out. So are they a native species? Are they not? We're not sure. And it just was really interesting because you get these people panicking about Japanese knotweed or whatever, something invading the country and taking over, and he put a totally different spin on it.
My favorite book that I read this year, though I think it was published late 2013, was The Girls of Atomic City, The Untold Story of the Women Who Helped Win World War II by Denise Kiernan. This is a historical book that talks about the Manhattan Project and talks about it through the lens of the vast array of women who worked on the project. It sort of follows the journey of, I think it's 5 or 6 different women who worked at various different levels, from janitorial right up to working on some of the science of purifying the uranium that they were using within the bombs. And it was a really fascinating read and really well told, in part from the angle of telling the story of these women and giving you a real sense of what it would have been like to be in that place and work in that job where you really didn't know what you were doing. You knew you were helping the war effort, and you had a task. And maybe that task was to sit on a stool and watch a dial. And if the dial went too far this way, then you had to twiddle some knobs down here to try and make it go the other way. But you didn't know what the knobs you twiddled did, and you didn't know what it was that the dial was showing you. You had very sort of narrow parameters for your task. It was a really fascinating read, in part for the individual stories, and also in part for the vast scope of this project, which, from my standpoint, I didn't realize how big this project was, how quickly it ramped up, and how complicated it was to get this off the ground. So it was very well written, very well told, and I love the structure of it, where you get to see it from kind of different perspectives throughout the book.
Okay, those all sound great, but can we go off format for a moment, because I would like to interject with my own favorite. Does anyone mind?
No.
Oh, go ahead.
Please do.
All right. So I have always been extremely interested in the potential ramifications of our dependence on technology. Like John, I do read a lot of technology books because I love tech, and I don't know if that's because it makes my life far better and easier than it would be otherwise, or if it's more of a Stockholm syndrome kind of way. I'm never sure, but I do love tech. So that said, I am always concerned about the possible downsides in regards to our work lives and the economy specifically. So I was thrilled to read The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a time of brilliant technologies. This was a fantastic book that was extremely unexpectedly even-handed about the pitfalls that we're facing in the future. And even better, it had a number of potential policy solutions that they prescribed that we could put in place now, maybe, to avoid massive disruption later. So that was definitely one of my favorite books of the year. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because I would love to interview either one of these authors, Eric Brynjolfsson or Andrew McAfee. And we did have one of those gentlemen scheduled, and something happened where they didn't show up, and I was very distressed. You can ask Rochelle. It was a fantastic book. And so I say this not to make the guy feel guilty, because honestly, I will not even be mad as long as one of you lets me interview you. So if anyone, any listeners out there know any of these authors, maybe you could exert some gentle pressure. And I'm feeling super creepy right now. Is this weird, guys? I'm basically stalking these two gentlemen. But if anyone knows these guys, please let them know that a nice lady in Canada would very deeply like to speak to them. So don't care.
Well, as long as you're not stalking your current guests, I think I'm okay with that.
I feel like that was pointed. Okay, now that's tough to segue back from. So let's take a break. You're tuned into Science for the People, and we'll be looking back a little bit more at 2014's best science books after this.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and we are talking about science books, as we do. I have three lovely panelists today. Brian Clegg, author of a wonderfully ridiculous number of popular science and math books, including most recently Final Frontier, the pioneering science and technology of exploring the universe. Also with me is John Dupuis, a science and engineering librarian at the Stacey Science and Engineering Library at York University in Toronto. And he's also the man behind the blog Confessions of a Science Librarian. And just to confuse everyone, we have our other host and the producer of Science for the People, Rochelle Saunders, on the other side of the mic. So let's talk about authors. What science authors do you love so much that you would pretty much read anything they wrote?
I'm a huge fan of Ian Stewart, who he writes primarily pop math books, and I haven't read anywhere near everything he's written. He's written quite a lot of stuff. He's also one of the two science writers who writes the science side of Terry Pratchett's Science of the Discworld series, which is really excellent. And the first Science of the Discworld book, I think, looking back, was like the book that got me back interested in reading pop science again and reading science books. I hadn't read any in ages. I was reading only fiction. And I really liked Terry Pratchett. And so I picked up this book, and it was not at all what I expected, but it was fantastic. And I've been pretty much hooked ever since. I'll
go with Jim Ottaviani, who writes graphic novels. He writes mostly published by First Second Press, which is an absolutely fabulous graphic novel publisher. And he mostly writes scientific biography graphic novels. The most recent one is one of my favorite 2014 books, which I just finished reading last night, is the Imitation Game, which he wrote with Leland Purvis, who did the artwork, which is a book basically about Alan Turing. And it was a fascinating book. That was his 2014 book. But he's also written books on Feynman, on Robert Oppenheimer. He wrote one a year or so ago called Primates, which was a biographical book about Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall, and Baruti Galdikas, some anthropologists. Also a fantastic book. And these are, the books that he writes are truly suitable for all ages. And so if I had to pick one author who I see a book by him, there's not even a 5-second thought process about picking it up.
Okay, I think for me it's Simon Singh, and I read his book Fermat's Last Theorem basically because it was the only interesting thing that was on sale in a ferry bookshop when I was on a ferry and needed a book. And that was the thing that started me science writing. That was the thing that made me say, I want to write stuff like that. That is brilliant. And I think Fermat's Last Theorem is probably my favorite of all these books, but he's just had one out on the mathematics in The Simpsons, which is absolutely fascinating as well, because I hadn't realized that quite a lot of the writers on The Simpsons are actually mathematicians, and they sneak maths into it in all kinds of places. So that's a really good book too. I also actually wanted to throw out a mention for Sam Keane, who I discovered just in the last couple of years, but he's a really fantastic writer. He wrote The Disappearing Spoon, The Violinist's Thumb, and I think most recently The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons. And he has a really great way of storytelling these kind of smaller tales from the annals of science around a particular theme. And just he's a really good storyteller and manages to find a hook in a lot of small kind of stories that you might normally not find that interesting, and he ties them together in a really fascinating way.
Now, I'm wondering, it's maybe it's just the way that you've described them, but all of these books sound fairly serious. Have you read any funny science books?
Well, Zombies in Calculus is hilarious. Basically, it's students wandering around a campus trying to eat all their professors.
You're right. So aside from that one, do we have any other funny science books you might have read this year?
I guess for me it was Randall Munro's What If, where he basically gives straight-faced answers to weird questions from readers, like how much force can Yoda output? I confess, he's well known for doing these XLCD cartoons online, which frankly I don't like. But the book is actually really great. There are so many answers. Some of them he takes to ridiculous extremes, but he puts really straight-faced answers to these weird questions, and it's good fun. I read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doty, who is known online, if you like YouTube videos, as the Ask a Mortician. And this book is, part of it is a memoir of her time starting out in the funeral industry. And there are parts of this book that are both really fascinating to kind of learn how that industry works and some of the process and science behind preserving bodies, how we do it today, why we do it, why maybe we shouldn't do it, how the crematory works. But there are some absolutely hilarious stories that she tells
that had me laughing. I read this book on an airplane coming back from England, and I was that person sitting in the aisle seat chuckling to myself most of the flight back to Canada. So I really enjoyed this book.
Okay. And I'll second the vote for What If. I haven't read the whole book yet, but it seems like it's definitely the kind of book that you can just dip in and out of. But what I have read is both very amusing and absolutely spot on.
This is Science for the People, and today we're helping you with your Christmas shopping by suggesting the best new science books for everyone on your gift list. So everyone that routinely listens to this show knows that we have a special place in our hearts for science history books. So any favorites from that genre that you haven't mentioned, perchance?
So for me, I hate to keep coming back to the graphic novels, but maybe I don't hate coming back to the graphic novels. But I think for me, one of the ones that I read this year that really stood out was by a graphic novel from First Second Press by Nick Bertozzi called Shackleton, Antarctic Odyssey. And basically, and I count kind of these exploration books. To me, they're close enough to science books to count. It's basically a short graphic novel, probably about 150 pages, describing the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition from 1914 to 1917 and the loss of the Endurance and just the extreme hardship, the crazy thing. I mean, at one point they were just floating on a small boat in the Antarctic Ocean for like a year, just, fishing and catching penguins to eat out of the side of the boat. Just a crazy, crazy story. It wasn't a story I was that familiar with. And for me, I thought it was a really, really wonderful way, a really short, punchy. Also, I mean, some of the stuff that happened to them was so absurd that it was strangely humorous at times, right? But yeah, I thought the Shackleton book I thought it was really wonderful.
Let me throw in a book called Serving the Reich by Philip Ball, which depicted the way 3 German scientists reacted to having to work under the Nazi regime. So you had Max Planck as the sort of old guard of German science, and then a Dutch immigrant, Peter Debye, and then Werner Heisenberg, who of course probably was the closest to actually collaborating. And it's quite fascinating that the way that science was treated under the regime, and also the way these individuals had to try, they were trying to live their lives, they were trying to survive in very difficult circumstances. And it really is quite a fascinating period in physics history.
I'm going to throw in The Science of Shakespeare, a new look at the playwright's universe. I love the way that, this is written by Dan Falk. And he really drills into this idea of what kind of science was going on, which we now look back at as sort of groundbreaking science. Some things like the heliocentric view of the universe from Copernicus. All that stuff was going on when Shakespeare was around, or just after Shakespeare was around. And Dan Falk looks at how much of this Shakespeare and sort of by contrast the common man might have known about, and how Shakespeare might have incorporated this into his work. It's a really fascinating story, both about some of the speculation around who Shakespeare was, and what type of person he was, and whether or not he was interested in science, but also a look at this era of science, in particular a lot of the astronomy that was going on and the transition from astrology to astronomy. It's a really fascinating read, and anybody who has a love of science and also a love of the arts, I think will really enjoy this one.
Okay, now what book would you give to that person in your life who doesn't usually read science books? Like a good hook them on science forever book. And you don't have to stick with 2014 for this. It could be a classic.
I would definitely say The Science of the Discworld books, especially if that person has ever read and enjoyed one of Terry Pratchett's Discworld books. The science writing in those books is really well done and really accessible for an absolute beginner in a way that isn't at all condescending and is quite often really humorous. They're a great series of books, and there's I think there's 5 of them now, but the first one I think is the best and definitely a standout. And you get a really cool little Discworld story in and around that. So that's one of my go-tos for people. The other one that I actually read this year that I am looking at giving to many people in my life is The Edge of the Sky by Roberto Trotta, which is a fascinating little physics book. His project was, could he explain complicated physics topics using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language. And he does it. And it's a fascinating read and really poetic and almost mythic. It sort of takes the history of the universe and some of these really dense physics topics and makes them something that you can tell a story about and something that you feel like you would talk about around a campfire, a story you might have heard from your grandmother. A really interesting book and superbly written and illustrated.
Can I add to that I'd also include that, although my only slight hesitation with it is his list of 1,000 words seems a little odd in that it's almost like he's gone out of his way to find words that aren't the ones he needed, because, for instance, atom is actually in the list of 1,000 words, but he doesn't use it. It's not in his list. And sometimes he does rather strange things, like he will refer to somebody's name, but he won't refer to the country they come from. He does that indirectly. So it irritated me on one side, but it is also absolutely fascinating and fun. The other thing I'd like to mention, which is very cheeky, is actually one of my own. It's called The Universe Inside You. And what it does is use your own body as a starting point to explore everything from atoms to the nature of the universe. And the reason I'd say it's a good one for people who don't usually read science books is it's the only one of my books my wife has deigned to read. So it must be okay.
So I'll pick one from this year that I quite liked and kind of an all-time classic, with the caveat that I think virtually any of the science graphic novels that I read generally work wonderfully in this kind of circumstance. Anyways, from this year I read this book, Wizards, Aliens, and Starships, Physics and Math in Fantasy and Science Fiction by Charles Adler. And so what he does is he takes kind of classic science fiction stories and uses them to illustrate themes or topics, ideas in physics and math in fantasy and science fiction. He uses mostly stories. Maybe he could have used kind of popular film or TV a little bit better to make it a little bit more broadly accessible. But I thought he did a great job of using science fiction as a way of explaining more detailed science. And I thought he did a really good job of that. And I would certainly give that book to a really, really wide range of people. From thinking of slightly older books, one that I think my favorite science graphic novel of all time is one called Logicomics and the authors have very long Greek names. So if they're listening, I apologize in advance. Apostolos Doxiadis and Christos Papadimitriou. It's basically the story of Bertrand Russell and his ideas, his kind of mathematical and philosophical ideas, kind of told with World War I as a backdrop. And it's beautifully illustrated and it's really compelling writing. And I think anybody could really enjoy that book.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but I really do need to know, what is the next book on your reading list?
So a couple of the books that have been mentioned today that are very very high on my to read list are Science of Shakespeare by Dan Falk, and one of the books that Brian mentioned, which isn't published in Canada or North America yet, I don't think, so I haven't really seen it. But it's definitely on my radar, was the Serving the Reich, The Struggle for the Soul of Physics Under Hitler. That sounds like a really, really fascinating book. That's also very high on my list.
Okay, I've got a book called Finding Zero by the veteran science writer Amir Axel. It's not actually out till June, but I do have an advanced copy sitting on my reading pile. And the idea is it's sort of exploration of the origins of numbers, and he seems to do it in a slightly Indiana Jones style. So he's going out there exploring, trying to find more of the location of the origin. I think sometimes the sort of combination of a travel story and science writing can work very well. So I'm looking forward to that.
I've got Shocked, Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead by David Casseret. And this is about the history and science of resuscitation, which I'm really interested to dig into. It looks fascinating, and it goes back a lot longer than I expected.
I have to point out that I'm reading The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution. And so far, it is awesome. So thank you very much to all of you. That was great. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. This was fun.
And for those of you listening in the car without a pen handy to jot down titles or authors and such, do not worry. Every book that we've mentioned today will be linked to in the show notes for this episode, which you can find on our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. And while you're on our site and thinking perhaps about Christmas shopping, have a look at our store where you can find Science for the People shirts and coffee mugs that make great stocking stuffers, if we do say so ourselves.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Before we sign off today, we wanted to talk about one last book we heard about, and think you'll want to hear about too. With me is James Lu Dunbar, an artist, writer, and science enthusiast who loves to make books. By day, he helps manage Serious Puppy Training School, James and Kenneth Publishers, and Dogstar Daily. And by night, he creates rhyming and illustrated educational books. He's here to talk about his book, The Universe Verse. Welcome, James.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, tell us a little bit about The Universe Verse.
Well, The Universe Verse is a scientifically accurate rhyming comic book that explains the origin of the universe, life on Earth, and the human race. And one of the first little bits of publicity I got was kind enough to refer to it as the product of Carl Sagan meets Dr. Seuss, which I was immensely flattered by and have enjoyed saying ever since.
I've heard of science books, and I've heard of comic books, and I've heard of rhyming books. You, sir, have combined all three. Why? What drew you to this format?
Well, growing up, I really loved the books of Dr. Seuss, so much so that if I came across a book that didn't have pictures and didn't rhyme, I kind of thought it wasn't really worth my time. Now, obviously, I've grown out of that, but I still do appreciate a good rhyme, and I do love to look at illustrations. So I wanted to make a book that was going to make science really engaging and attractive to kind of the widest audience possible, and especially young children. And so kind of thinking back onto my youth and knowing how much I really enjoyed books that rhymed and books that had cool pictures, I thought, hey, I should add some rhyming and cool pictures to my science book. So that's what I did. And of course it was pretty challenging, but 7 years later, I'm all done. So
it sounds like Dr. Seuss was a pretty big inspiration for you. What about Dr. Seuss inspires you?
Well, I think initially it was just how much fun the books were. When you're coming at it as a little kid, hearing the rhyme and the rhythm and the zany illustrations, it's just really appealing, I think on a visceral, kind of primal level. But as I got older, what really appealed to me was I came to realize that some of his books are actually kind of about relatively adult topics. You've got the Butter Battle book, which some people have heard of, some people haven't. It's kind of about mutually assured destruction in the Cold War. And of course, the Lorax, which almost everyone's heard of, is about environmental conservation and overlogging and stuff like that. You've got Yertle the Turtle, it's about totalitarianism, and it's a critique of Hitler. And so you've got some books that a lot of people would have thought are not for children, but he presents them in a way that's so much fun that children and adults alike love reading them. And, maybe a little kind of morality message sneaks in under the radar. People don't even realize it.
So who's the target audience of your book?
Well, I was aiming for a book that would be accessible to kind of the youngest audience possible and then still pack in some pretty serious science. And so I think what I ended up with is kind of middle school, so 5th to 8th grade, around 10 to 12 years old. But what I found is by kind of combining this kind of silly, childish format with some pretty abstract concepts and pretty deep science, it really appeals to anyone who likes science of any age, because you kind of get, whether you're a grad student or a, high school science teacher, it's fun to see how the rhymes connect and how, the illustrations play out with these pretty abstract and challenging concepts. But on the other end, I've also been reading it to my daughter, and she's just turned 1, so she's enjoying it. I don't know how much is really comprehended, but she does enjoy the experience, though.
For our listeners, can you give us a little bit of a rundown of some of the topics that you talk about in the book?
Yeah. So it really goes from the Big Bang to it culminates with the scientific method is the big finale, and along the way we hit the creation of energy and space, time, 4 fundamental forces, and matter and particles and atoms and elements, all the way up through bacteria, photosynthesis, extinctions, multicellular organisms, fossils, dinosaurs, mammals, primates, humans, consciousness, language, agriculture, civilization. So, yeah, it's pretty broad, so obviously I can't go into too much depth, but I do hit a couple things that a lot of people who, if they're not scientists, are actually gonna learn something, even the adults.
Okay, so you have an extra special December promo going on right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm all for science for the people, and I really want to get this book in front of as many people as possible. So all December, I'm making the book available for free download as a PDF ebook. So if you go onto my website, which is jldunbar.com, and then you click on the universe first, then you'll see how to download it there. And then also for your listeners, if anyone is interested in buying the hardcover, it of course makes an excellent gift for the holidays or any time of year. But I've created a special promo code for you guys, SFTP, Science for the People, and that'll get you 20% off copies of the hardcover. So if anyone's interested in actually getting the physical book object, it did turn out quite handsomely.
So this is for the digital, the free download is a digital PDF version, and I assume it is fully iPad and e-reader friendly?
Yep. Anywhere you can read a PDF, you should be able to load it on. There's no digital rights management, so, you can copy it and shouldn't have any trouble with the computers squawking up about not being compatible. It's just a PDF, so, should fit anywhere.
And for those of us who do love having a solid book in our hands, you told us where we could purchase the book, but could you tell us how much it is?
Yeah, the list price is $24.95. So with the promo code of 20% off, that'll be $5 off each copy. And you can get it on my website. You can also get it on Amazon, and it is available through national distributors, so select bookstores will be carrying it as well. And if your local one is not carrying it, you can certainly ask for it, and they can order it. And if you want to support your local brick-and-mortar shop, I totally understand that philosophy as well.
So it sounds like there are a lot of different ways to get your book and to make sure you get it in your hot little hands before Christmas.
Mm-hmm, precisely.
James, thanks so much for being here and for sharing your book with us this Christmas.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
If you want to take advantage of James's December special gift, you can find it at James' website at jldunbar.com, a link which we'll make sure is available in the show notes for this episode. Remember also that you can get $5 off when you order a hardcover of The Universe Verse if you use the coupon code SFTP. Also, do click the links to our Facebook page and our Twitter feed, where you can keep up with the latest from the Science for the People team. And of course, you can always find us on iTunes, where you can subscribe to future shows, listen to our past episodes, or leave a thoughtful review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Science for the People.
Science for the People is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta. The show is produced by Rochelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our promotions manager. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. K.O. Myers updates our website. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. Ed Haynes is our guest coordinator. We get research help from Josh Whitten. The show is edited by K.O. Myers and Ryan Bromsgrove. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders, Marie Claire Shanahan, and me, Desiree Schell.